Hello guys, Mike from the WCA for the Week 4 update. We're going to take a look at a game played between Sebastian and Elena. This was from our 2 o'clock class this week. Both of these players are pretty similar in that their ratings are about the same. They're new tournament players. So what we're looking for here in terms of progress is the overall feel to the game. Was it a clean game? And what we mean by that is, were the pieces coming out in the correct order, or at least with some idea of working with each other? Were there a lot of one-move blunders? Very often with games under 1,000, let's say, there's numerous one-move blunders that take place. In this game, there were some inaccuracies, which is a very different word to use. A blunder is an outright mistake. This game was decided at the very, very end. And it turned out to be a one-move mistake that decided the game, but it came so late and was a little bit more difficult to see. So it wasn't like the winner of the game won because their opponent just gave away a queen or something. It was a little more subtle, but still overall very, very clean game. A couple of other things to note before we show you what happened. Their notation is superb. The handwriting that both of these kids have is so easy to read, and more importantly, it's not just that it's easy to read. What they wrote on the paper actually happened in the game. As we compared this move by move, we found only at the very end of the game that there were some inaccuracies in terms of one player being a half a step behind. But what they did do, which is encouraging, is they didn't stop notating. When you are notating a tournament game and you realize you've made a mistake, don't stop. All you have to do is make a little mark on the paper, and that will remind the coaches that you are having trouble at that point, and we can usually pretty much figure out what was missing. Okay, so let's get to the game. Sebastian has the white pieces, Elena has the black pieces, and let's take a look at the opening. So e4, e5, the typical opening of the players at this level, knight f3. However, Elena has already become fond of playing the move knight f6 here, which is called the Petrov defense. The Petrov is basically a counterattack. So you're telling white, you can go ahead and take this pawn here, but I may go ahead and take yours. So what happens very often with this opening, if you're not familiar with it, what kids will do is they will both take. So as you'll see, white takes the pawn, black takes the pawn, and then white follows up with queen e2. And there have been so many scholastic games that are lost in this position because black simply retreats their knight, allowing this discovered check. Knight c6, and the game is essentially over. Because as you'll see, the white queen is checking the black king, and the knight here that I've highlighted on c6 is attacking the black queen. This is really, really bad for black. The game is basically over. Anyway, the main line of the Petrov, so after knight f6, white does in fact take the pawn, but black usually doesn't take back. The main move here is d6, chasing the knight back to f3, and then black can comfortably take here on e4, because if white tries to pin, you can break the pin with your own queen. So for example, if I play queen e2 here, you can always just break the pin with your own queen, and there are no tricks in this position. However, from here, a move that I like for scholastic players, which is not the main move, but it is played at the grandmaster level, is to immediately challenge this knight with knight c3. So you develop a piece, and you kind of tell black, either go back or take me. So if they take, you now have a choice of which pawn to capture with. And this is an important concept because in previous videos and in lots of other places where you can study chess, you'll see that you're often taught to capture towards the center, which would mean in this position to capture with the b pawn. But in the opening, it's very often correct to take with this pawn, with the d pawn. So it feels funny to go away from the center, but by doing that in this position, I'll give you some highlights. You'll notice that both of white's bishops are open. The queen here on d1 has an open file, and you have these 4 pawns now on the queen side. So what generally happens here, white will take advantage of these pawns by castling queenside. And that is a very common occurrence in this structure because you have an extra pawn to protect your king. It's true that these c-pawns are doubled and that later in the endgame it could be a problem, but always remember that endgame is a long, long way away. So this is a way that I would recommend scholastic players to go at this with white. Okay, so let's get back to the game. So after Elena's knight f6, Sebastian, at his level, probably not familiar with too much theory in this opening, plays a good move. He just develops a knight to c3, inviting Elena to go into a 4 knights opening or something along those lines. So this perhaps could have confused her, and she plays here the move d6, which may not be the best here because you'll notice this pawn chain that she creates here kind of restricts her dark squared bishop. And whenever you see this pawn chain as white, so you'll have a pawn on c7, d6, and e5, and it's a king pawn opening, a very good way to approach this is to immediately open up the game. And that would be with the move here, d4. And by playing d4, you're giving black a challenge on this square, e5, because you'll see here it's attacked twice. And if they take, for example, taking back here in this position just gives you more space. Now, why are we using the word space? Well, in chess, space is the room that you have to work with, and that's determined by the pawn structure. And you'll notice if we got to this position that the white pawn on e4 is actually on the 4th rank for white, and the black pawn up here on d6 is only on the 3rd. Now, don't look at this number 6 when you hear me say the 3rd rank. For black, this pawn is on the 3rd. This would be black's 1st, black's 2nd, the pawn is on the 3rd. So if I have a pawn on the 4th and you have one only on the 3rd, that gives me a bit more space to work with. So if Sebastian in this position could play the move d4, he's going for the opportunity of getting more space. What he does, however, is he plays the move d3. Now, what he did essentially is the same thing that Elena did, is he restricted his king's bishop. So you have to be careful by doing that because you're not giving yourself an opportunity to get that bishop out to its strongest square. So let me take you back for 1 second. You remember e4, e5, knight f3. One of the openings in this position is called the Philidor defense, and that's with d6. It's not as popular as bringing the knight out, but what it does is gets this light squared bishop quickly into the game, and black is going to play kind of a quiet, restricted opening for a while. But if you were following before, let's say we had reached this position, what do you think we would recommend Sebastian do? Well, that's right, play d4. Again, try to open the center and put a lot of pressure on that e5 pawn. If black takes, you're going to have more space. You take back with your knight. But an interesting move in this position is you can actually take with your queen. And this is an opening idea that comes up in multiple choices. This is not just from the Philidor defense or a double king pawn opening. This idea comes in a lot of different openings. Now, at first glance, it appears with the queen on d4, you're asking to get hit with knight c6, which is going to chase your queen away. But you don't have to move your queen in this position. So if you need to pause the video, you can. So what move could white play here that would allow him to keep his queen in the center? And that would be the move bishop to b5, pinning the knight. So if black breaks the pin with d7, if you want to keep your queen in the center, you should give up your bishop for the knight. Say black takes back, and now just develop your pieces. So for example, knight c3, knight f6, bishop g5, pinning the knight, bishop e7, preparing to castle and breaking that pin, and let's say white castles queenside. This would be an ideal position for white. It's not winning, it's not a significant advantage, but as a player at the WCA, we would highly encourage you to get into opening structures where your rooks are connected. You can see down here I'll toggle between the two rooks, meaning your minor pieces have found homes. You're castled, and your rooks are getting ready to start working on these open and half open files. Okay, so that's just an idea that could have come up from the structure these kids were in. So let's go back. It's Sebastian's move is white in this position, and he chooses the quiet d3. Okay, losing? Absolutely not. Just not as aggressive as he could have been. Okay, so Elena plays bishop to e7, and the kids start developing logically. Bishop g5, and Elena asks the question to the bishop, what do you want to do? You can maintain the pin by backing up, but Sebastian decides to trade, and this is not a bad trade for him because when she takes back here with the bishop, you'll notice that these black pawns in the center being on dark squares makes this bishop, right now anyway, not highly effective. You'll also notice that in this position she has the two bishops, which would mean later in the game she would want to open this position up. So strangely enough, after the trade, Sebastian now decides to play d4, which is a tempo behind where he could have been before. So here Elena castles, but why not take the pawn? Because if you take it, you'll notice you open this space, so you can't take back this time with the queen, with the bishop here, so you'll say take back with your knight, and the scope or the mobility of this bishop has improved. And again, a good idea to do with your opponent is fight him or her for time. And what do we mean by that? The knight on d4 is protected by this queen. It's attacked once. If you play a move like knight c6, you develop with a tempo, meaning white can't do whatever he wants here because this knight on d4 is attacked twice. So you could retreat this knight, and by doing so, putting this knight here wins a full tempo for black, or you can trade it off. If you take it, these are doubled pawns that you should not be afraid of. Now remember, black has the two bishops, so these pawns could be used later in the game to push up and open the center, which would make both bishops very strong. That's number one. Let me show you one highlight here. So we've already talked about the two bishops, but these pawns that are highlighted as well are very useful to fight against this knight here on c3, because you'll see it doesn't have any forward squares to get to. So for a knight to be effective, it normally has to get at least to the fourth rank, hopefully in here into your opponent's territory, but these pawns do a nice job of restricting that piece. Another highlight is the number of squares those two pawns are controlling. So remember, each pawn, unless it's a rook pawn of course, attack two squares. So this pawn duo here on c6 and d6 are controlling these four very important squares. So this would be a very comfortable position for black to play had that happened. So Elena, slight inaccuracy, probably should have taken on d4, but instead she replaced it with the move castling. As coaches, when we're working with players at this rating, when we see them make a small inaccuracy but replace it with a move that makes sense, in our minds it's not an error at all. It's actually a sign of progress, that they're starting to make slight inaccuracies as opposed to one move blunders. So so far so good. This clearly could be a game between two masters. This is very well played so far, this opening. Okay, so now Sebastian decides to trade, offering a trade of queens here, which he probably should take here, because if he takes, let's say the rook takes back, you might have an opportunity to post your knight in on d5, which would hit the bishop, also hit the pawn here on c7. Looks like a nice active continuation, and instead he chooses to play bishop to c4. So again, would the trade of the queens here maybe have helped him? Possibly. But what did he replace it with? He developed a piece, and he's giving himself the opportunity to castle now if he wants. So here, Elena decides to trade the queens and plays the move queen takes queen. Now, Obviously, we know Sebastian is going to take back, but let's first answer this question. Players of all levels get confused as to when is it appropriate to trade queens. For this age group, and more importantly this rating group, we recommend any trade that you think helps your position. So when Elena makes this trade here, Sebastian takes back with his rook. And by taking with the rook, you see he controls the only open file on the board. So did that trade help black? It's hard to say that it did, so Elena probably shouldn't have made the move. Well, if you're not going to make the move, then back here, what could you replace it with? This position here, what could you replace it with? Well, you can stop your video and see if you can find a move for black, but we looked at moves like bishop to g4 or moves like knight to c6. Just bring another piece into the game, and maybe you can encourage Sebastian to take you, and then you could take back and control the open file. Okay, so let's get back to the game. Queen took, rook took. Now knight c6, castles, bishop to e6, and at this point we get this classic battle between light square bishops, and it happens with dark square bishops as well over here. But in this position, when it's the light square bishops that look at each other here, very often making this trade is not great for you, because when black takes back, this pawn here is usually it's a good trade for black because it controls central squares and it opens up a rook. However, in this position, there's a slight difference. Let me show you. Let's go back for a minute to the basic opening when you have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Let's say you have a typical scholastic game where the kids bring the pieces out in some order like this. Let's say h3, which, you know, they'll make an escape square earlier than necessary. d6, knight c3. And then you'll see that this move h3 is actually useful because it prevents this bishop from coming here, pinning the knight. So what about bishop e6? Well, this is the same exact position of the bishops anyway that Sebastian had in the game. So here's the position with Elena, and here's the position that I'm showing you as an example. There is a difference. Now if you take this bishop and black takes back, it's the same capture with the pawn. The only difference is, and I'll put a highlight on for you, the f pawn that came into the center is part of a much larger group of pawns, and we call this a pawn island. They can support each other, and they can be used to control multiple squares in the center. In the game with Sebastian, when he takes Elena's bishop, and she takes back, you'll notice that these two pawns are separated from these two and from this group over here. So technically, in terms of structure, we would say that black now has 3 pawn islands. Go back to the previous example, black only has 2. So an island can be defined as pawns that are connected by files. So as long as they're touching at least a pawn on an adjacent file, you can consider them to be one island. Here, all of these pawns are connected by one file, even these doubled pawns, because they're connected to the d pawn here. So the less islands you have, generally the less weakness that you have in your structure. So when Sebastian goes for this trade, and he did, he is giving Elena these doubled pawns that can't support or work with other pawns that are in the position. So it could be a slight weakness. Okay, so let's see how he took advantage of it. After the move, he decided to play the move h3. Now, at his level and his rating, that could just be his idea of making an escape square for the king, and it's also very, very possible he's not sure what to do in this position. So what would you do if we back this move up? is there a better way or a different plan for you to play as white? And we're sure when we go over this game with the group, and we will, because there's some ideas here we want everybody to see in case they don't get to the video. A move like rook to d2 is possible, because when you play rook d2, you can see you're preparing to double rooks. So let's just say Elena challenges that rook. You support the rook with the rook on f1, and if she takes, you take back with the rook, and you'll see that you're now controlling the the only open file in the game. So what Sebastian does is, after h3, he allows Elena to play the move rook a to d8, now challenging the rooks in an equal fashion, because there's one rook facing the other, not supported by another rook. And here, the first, or another slight inaccuracy, now he plays rook to d2. But the difference, as you'll see, is after she takes, he has to take back with a knight, and the knight is not useful on this open line. So naturally, after that trade, she immediately attacks the knight with the rook and gaining control of the only open file. And remember, let's say that black is slightly better here because of that rook controlling the file. That's not the only factor in the game. So Sebastian's play, while it may not have been perfect, it's still very, very, very good. Because what does she have as black besides this rook? She has a bishop here that is still restricted by this pawn. So even though her rook is dominant, it's not necessarily enough to win the game here, because she still has other pieces on the board that are not really working. Let me put a highlight on for you. These are the squares on the open file that are in Sebastian's territory. So let's go from the top down. The d4 square can be occupied by this knight, but if the rook comes in, it'll be captured by the knight. So the rook's not going here. It's not coming to d3 because of the pawn. It's not coming to d2 because of this same knight, and obviously it's not coming all the way up the board because it will be captured. So even though it looks really strong, and it definitely is placed well, it's not posing any immediate threat to Sebastian. So that's a very good idea to remember. Rooks on open files can be dangerous, but if their penetration squares are covered, you're probably okay. All right, so now I love Elena's next move, a nice aggressive posting of the knight in the center of the board. It not only centralizes the knight, but it also attacks a pawn on c2. Now, Sebastian takes this knight, and let's go back for a moment and see if we had an alternative to taking the knight. Okay, the pawn is attacked, but here you have something of a tactical way to protect the pawn, and you could do it by putting your rook underneath the knight. And if you did that, let's say the knight took the pawn, you then take here check, and when they take back, you can take this pawn here. So the position ends up getting what appears to be a little messy, but at the same time, black is not doing anything so terrible to white. White can probably hold this position, or perhaps the player who has a better feel for the endgame would win this. So let's go in again to Elena's move. What Sebastian did is he decided to take, and it's a small mistake, because when he takes, she has a choice of how to take back, and she chose the correct, the right option. She took with her pawn, which does a lot. Number one, it attacks this knight on c3. It's going to force the knight to move. That's number one. Number two, you'll notice that this pawn, and these three are now separated by only one file, which means that trade Sebastian made reconnected her pawns. It also gave this bishop an opening to come into the game, because if you go back, if you can somehow force black to keep a pawn on e5, you're shutting out the longest diagonal on the board. By making the trade, you're extending that pawn into white's territory, and that bishop is going to get quite strong from that little perch up there on f6. Okay, so he plays an aggressive move. He puts the knight on b5, and here Elena had a chance to set a little bit of a trap with the move c6. And c6 will pretty much force this knight back to a3. You may ask, well, there's a pawn hanging on a7. Why can't I just take it? Well, you should pause the video. And this is a very common trap. After rook a8, the piece is trapped. So if the knight takes on c6, for example, there's really nothing better. You take back, and you'll notice here that this rook is attacking a2, and that's not a pleasant pawn to defend. You'll probably have to push your a pawn. You rarely want to play moves like this with a rook. If you put your rook on a1 and babysit that pawn, I agree it is a passed pawn, but it's not going to turn out well. This rook is so passive here. So for example, Elena could play d3, which opens up the bishop to the b pawn. So if you take that pawn, then she takes on b2, and when you move your rook, you could even attack my bishop, or her bishop in this case. It's not a problem because the rook takes, and black is up a piece here. I think white has one pawn for it. It's not enough. This is a losing position. Okay, so on knight b5, Elena had the chance to play that move c6, but she plays a clever move too. She plays d3. And with d3, she is kind of forcing the issue. She is telling white, you pretty much have to deal with this pawn because it's getting it's dangerously close to becoming a queen. And once pawns start to control squares this close to your position, you could have a very, very, a very difficult time there. Okay, so let's go back. We seem to have some technical difficulties here. All right, we have to deal with this small screen for a moment, which is okay. So in the position here, after the capture, so we have the knight to b5, she plays d3, and on d3, Sebastian ends up getting in trouble. What he did in the position was take this pawn here, and that created a big problem because of the move pawn takes c2, and now the game is essentially over. Why is it over? Because this rook here is controlling down to the d1 square. There's no way to stop this from queening because there's going to be a check on this line. So once he took, there's no way to prevent this rook from coming down to this square, and it turned out the class was ending and Sebastian had to resign. But overall, a terrific game. Hope you enjoyed it. Sorry about the technical difficulty at the end, but it was fortunately just on the last couple of moves. If there's time, always go over the videos more than once, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Don't forget to wish your moms a happy Mother's Day.